The following story has been brought to you by StoriesToInspire.org.
Amongst the prisoners in the Auschwitz concentration camp was Reb Tzvi Hirsch Meisels. Reb Tzvi Hirsch Meisels, there are many stories that we've said before about him and that he's been involved in, but listen to this story. Reb Tzvi Hirsch Meisels was a dedicated Rav to his communities, to his tzibur, until of course the Nazis in Makshimum came in and invaded, when eventually they forced Rav Meisels and his family away from their home. And at that point, when they did that, there was very little opportunity for them to take anything. There was almost no time to take anything, to have the thought of what exactly they could take with them. But there was one item that Tzvi Hirsch Meisels did want to bring with him, and he thought very much about. And that's those few moments that he did get to think about what to bring with him. There was one item, and that was his talus. Now, he had in his possession a very, very precious talus that wasn't just his own. It was actually a gift from his father-in-law. That this talus belonged to a huge tzaddik, Rav Moshe Teitelbaum. Rav Moshe Teitelbaum was the Bala Machaba, the Yitav Lev, and he was zoicha to have this talus. But Tzvi Hirsch Meisels, so when he was taken out by the Nazis, he made sure to take that talus with him, because he knew. Chazal tell us very clearly that a talus is a protection, it's a shmira from any ra, from any evil. And therefore he was convinced that not only is it a regular talus, but it's also a talus that had belonged to a tremendous tzaddik, and therefore he wanted to use that as his shmira, as his protection. He had no idea what was about to befall him. In those days, they didn't know what was coming their way, and therefore they sensed danger, but still they didn't know the magnitude of what it would be. But he wanted to make sure he had shmira. When he arrived in Auschwitz, so as we know, the Yidden at the time, as they arrived to the concentration camps, were asked to give away all their possessions. So, yes, they were told originally that they were going to a work camp and they could take with them a minimum amount of possessions. Once they actually got to the concentration camp, they, at the end of the day, were told to give up their possessions and were no longer allowed it. But Rabbi Meisels had no choice at that stage but to give over his precious talus. He had no choice. But he was determined to do whatever he could. He couldn't do it then, but he was determined at any stage in the near future to get back that talus. Now, he made a lot of inquiries there were Jews that used to work in various sorting departments that would sort out the possessions that the Jews that just came in. So he got friendly with some of them, and he made inquiries, and he found out that most of the confiscated possessions were brought to one specific location in the camp. They would be sorted out, that any item of substantial value would generally be sent to Germany for the Germans to use, for the government or for the army personnel to use. Now, somehow, Rabbi Meisels managed to join the group of prisoners that was actually assigned to sort out the possessions. Now, during the work, he was obviously looking for his own possessions as well as obviously having to do the work of sorting out other Jews' possessions. He found his precious talus amongst his search. And you can imagine the simcha that he had to be able to find not only his own talus, but the talus that was given to him by his father, that belonged to a Moshe Teitelbaum, the Yitav Lev. It was a tremendous simcha. He got it, and he's thinking, what is he going to do with himself? What's he going to do with it? It's not like they had pockets and things they could stuff things in. So he wrapped it around his body in a way that it wouldn't be, so obvious. And obviously had his clothing on top of that. And he slowly managed to bring it back to where he slept in his barrack. But he knew there's no question, that what he did was subject to death. Right? If they would have found out, or if they do find out what he did, he would immediately be shot, and maybe all the people around him. But there's no question about it, he had taken his life into his own hands. If the guards would have found out what he did, there's no way he would have been killed on the spot. But it was his talus, and it was shmira, and he was willing to take the risk. Again, we never ask questions when it comes to these things because we don't understand what they went through, and therefore we don't ask halachic questions of how they could do that. They did it. Now, to minimize the risk of keeping it, Rabbi Meisels was forced to cut the talus, because a huge talus obviously will be very obvious, and there's no way you can hide a thick thing in the middle of a barrack. So what he had to do is he cut it down. And he cut it down to become a talus cotton. And he figured that his biggest chance of keeping it for as long as possible and using it as a shmira that no one would chop would be to make it into a talus cotton. He could sort of fit it under his clothing, tuck in the strings, and this way no one would be able to chop what it was. Now remember, that doesn't mean that what he did was okay. if they would find that out, they would also realize that this is something against the law, against what they were allowing, and therefore they would have put him to death. That wouldn't have been a question. Remember, we all know and we're familiar with the clothing that they had. It was as thin as anything. It was as thin as paper, right? It wasn't this thick thing. So he could have been, in a moment, he could have been found out. But again, he was willing for the mitzvah of tzitzis. The Mesirat Nefesh that he had was able to do that. Now, that was the risk that he was able to take. Now, it was an incredible thing. He wore a talis cotton every single day in Auschwitz. Can you imagine? In the concentration camp, right? Until the final days of the war, when he was working in a labor camp nearby, and it was the time that the Germans decided to empty the labor camp of all its prisoners. Now, the sound of the American gunfire could be heard in the distance, and everybody was attempting to try and run as much as they could. The ruthless Nazis took with them any Jews that were alive, and before boarding the cattle cars, yet for another time, the inmates were searched in case they had anything of value on them before they went onto the cattle cars. It was then that the talis cotton of Rabbi Meisel's was finally found on him at that time. A German guard actually ripped the garment when he found it off Rabbi Meisel's body and threw it straight into the fire that was nearby, obviously to the Rav's horror. Rabbi Meisel's was devastated. Can you imagine? He managed pretty much the entire war that he was in the concentration camp to wear this talis cotton, to have that shmira. And he believed, and which makes sense from this week's parasha, that the talis cotton that he wore was the source of the fact that he was able to leave the war and he was alive at the end of the war. That was the source of protection. Now, the Germans at that stage were in a huge panic, because all of a sudden the Americans were coming in, and they didn't know where to go, where to turn, and they didn't know their danger that was getting to them. Now, he had his talis cotton gone, but Rabbi Meisel's knew that there were other Jews who also survived to the point had done so without this talis cotton. And just as Hashem has watched over them, he would continue to watch over him. The Nazis herded their prisoners into the cattle cars in their obviously brutal way. The cars, as we know, had no ventilation, no food or water for the Jews that were packed tight one next to the other with no room to move. The wicked guard who had destroyed his talis cotton was one of those who were placed in the actual car that Rabbi Meisel was traveling in with his son, Rabbi Meisel's son, Zalman Leib. Can you imagine? He saw the guard that had ripped off his talis cotton and he believed was his shmira, his protection during those years in the war. And that was the guard that was assigned to be there in his cattle car to watch over them. Now, the guards obviously made sure that the conditions that they had for themselves were obviously much better than the prisoners had, and they put benches down in the middle, and they, relaxed over it, whatever it was, and they had loads of food and loads of drink, because, they had no problem with being there and traveling. Darkness eventually fell as the train wound its way to the countryside. Rabbi Meisel was overcome by exhaustion at that stage, attempted to try and sleep in the only way possible, which was while standing. That was the only way to sleep at the time. Being in a cattle car was as you stood. Now, you put your head to the left, you rest on the shoulder of his son, and eventually Zalman Leib would rest his head on his father's shoulder, and that's how they spent the night in the cattle car since the war had begun, and that's what they were used to. Rabbi Meisel was only asleep for a few minutes when he was awakened by his son in an anguished voice, "Tati, Tati, my shoulder hurts so much, I can't take the pain any longer." Rabbi Meisel at that point obviously had no choice but to raise his own head, and he did find, however, his son's complaint to be a bit strange, because they've done this many, many times, and his son never complained about the pain on his shoulder. Rabbi Meisel's neighbor to the right then told the Rav, please rest your head on his shoulder. Rabbi Zalman Leib, the Rav's son, overcome by exhaustion, placed his own head on his neighbor to his left. Moments later, the sound of the American warplane was heard. The drone of the engine mixed with the sound of gunfire as the Air Force crews, mistakenly assuming that the train was actually carrying German soldiers, started to try and rain down ammunition on the train. And suddenly gunfire ripped a hole in the roof of the car in which Rabbi Meisel stood and shot directly between the tilted heads of the Rav and his son, hitting the guard and tearing off both of his hands. Soon afterwards, the sound of the planes grew fainter as they headed off, and the Jews in that car were, Baruch Hashem, unharmed. Now you can imagine the German guard, who had thrown the Rav's talis in the fire, screamed in pain and begged everyone around him to do something for him. One of the other guards called out, "Well, I guess you won't be able to throw any other Jew's prayer shawl into the fire anymore." At that point, when he heard that, this German soldier turned to Rabbi Meisels and begged for forgiveness. Rabbi Meisels had within him a small book of Tehillim, which he hadn't stopped saying Tehillim since the German invasion had begun, and they started saying, "Hinei lo yonim v'lo yishon shomi Yisrael." And he realized at that time, and this story is brought down in Sefer Mekadshei Hashem, that he realized the protection that the talis cotton that the tzitzis had given him, and the punishment that this German guard had got so swiftly and so obviously, that was pointed out by another German, that he had done that, thrown a Jewish prayer shawl into the fire, that protection of tzitzis. Now Rabbi said, just to end the story with a simple idea, the Mesirat Nefesh that he had, we're not asking anyone to be on that level, we're not on that level. Baruch Hashem, we don't have the nisyonis of that either, and we never asked to be in a matzav of nisoyin. But just a little bit of Mesirat Nefesh. Tzitzis is a beautiful mitzvah. It's an easy mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that offers tremendous protection. Sometimes we are very lax in it because, no, I need it, I don't need it, it's hot, it's uncomfortable, whatever. I get that, it's hard. But look at the Mesirat Nefesh that Yidden had for a simple mitzvah of tzitzis. Simple mitzvah of tzitzis, what they were willing to do and give up for tzitzis is unbelievable. I think that should be this week's parasha Shlach, a tremendous chizuk for ourselves in this most incredible and beautiful mitzvah of tzitzis, and through that we should be zocher to the brachas that Chazal tell us, that when we wear tzitzis, we're gathered the Shechina, we're going to get tremendous siyata d'shmaya and bracha that comes to all of our lives.
Enjoyed this story? Come again. Bring a friend. StoriesToInspire.org